good thing.
I'm a dentist.
Okay, we're ready to go, and I claim chair's privilege in asking the first question. Revolt. And I want to attack Tecumseh.
Unpredictable.
Right. Putting it in fairly strong terms, I think all this stuff with birds learning patterns like A and B and is irrelevant to human language evolution. Point number one, the formal language theory is a beautiful object, beautiful structure. It deals with mathematical objects, all of which are infinite. I mean, the actual theorems only work if you're talking about infinite sets. You're talking about, right, okay. So then the application to human language involves an intuitive step. It's not plausible, for example, that humans use finite state grammars to produce the sentences that they do. It's much more plausible intuitively. And especially given the fact that we understand their meanings, that the sentences humans produce are produced by something like context-free grammar, so maybe slightly more complicated. Right? You heard Chomsky the other day saying that the basic operation of merge is of conceptual intentional representations, and the main function, according to him, and certainly I would doubt that our function of language is computation, internal computation of thought, meaningful objects. Right? But the notes that the birds are combining are not meaningful. So
that's why we have to use this technique to study.
Well, that's also why it's not relevant to the case of human language, because when I produce some sentence, or when a human produces some sentence, which you can analyze as A and B, or exemplifying that pattern, it's because the sentence is meaningful, and we attribute it to the structure we do because of our ability to interpret it. So the big element that's missing is meaning. So.
And attack. Thank you for that wonderful attack. Look, of course, language is different from a lot of things because it has meaning. It's equally different from human music, from a lot of human music, or from these abstract visual patterns. I'm trying to account for an aspect of language that might be shared. So that's not something that Chomsky is necessarily important. I don't think Chomsky cares whether language shares something with music or not. It's something I care a lot about. And if we want to study that problem, even within our species, we have to exclude meaning. Now, we all know, of course, that meaning is really important in language. I accept that fully. But that doesn't mean that that's the only thing that's important. And I think it's very important to take each one of these possibilities and evaluate them on their own terms. We should talk about speech. I don't think speech is an externalization is irrelevant either. I think that's something that we need to know. To what extent does that play a role? To what extent is that evolutionarily novel or not? So back to infinity. So you're absolutely right. But to prove a theorem in formal language theory, you rely on infinity. The same is true of the Fourier transform. To prove the Fourier transform, you need to use infinity. But we use the Fourier transform every day on all of our cell phones in a very finite way with an n equals 128 or n equals 256, and it works. Okay, so infinity is a tool that mathematicians use to prove theorems. That doesn't mean that the theorems become false as soon as you're using finite sets. So that the infinity is just to show that it works for any finite set. Right? So I think that's the complete. I really don't think that's a telling criticism. You had one other one. What was it? Oh, birdsong. Yeah. Well, birdsong is similar to that meaning. That's of course true. That's also a virtue. I mean, that's exactly why we predicted that birds that have song learning should be good at this. Forget about meaning. There is no meaning. And that's what we want if we're just looking at pure structure.
But it could be the case that language only has the structure it does because it conveys meaning.
That could be. What about music then? Where's that concerned?
I don't know.
Well, it's kind of a technical question. Do you know of any work on animals that is trying to show their capacity to deal with context-free grammars with strings that are different from A and N? Because these strings are highly ambiguous. As you pointed out, there are all sorts of ways to capture them, right? So it could be a finite state automaton plus a counter, or it could be a push-down storage automaton, or it could be a context-sensitive grammar. So it could be all sorts of things. There are other types of languages that would pick the context-free level in a less ambiguous way. Like, for instance, a string followed by the mirror image of that string. So ABC followed by CBA, and that would really be context. So is there any attempt to deal with such things?
We're working with mirror grammar, palindrome grammar, which is a minor variant of that, copy grammar, which is a mildly context-sensitive grammar. So with humans, we've done all of those, and we can show that humans can easily do all of those. We're now looking at that in kids, trying to push that back. I have a student now who's going to start working with the Kias, with these parrots, with the mirror grammar. But the work that we have on bird symmetry, it shows that several different bird species, starlings included, so starlings and pigeons, fail to be able to do things like mirrored patterns of dots. So they can't discriminate an arbitrary pattern of mirrored dots from one that has various square things. So that's not exactly the same thing because that's happening in 2 dimensions, but formally it's quite close to a fair grammar. But you're absolutely right. I've never meant to say that these 2 grammars are going to answer the world of formal language theory. There's a lot of other things to test. And there's plenty of subregular grammars that are quite interesting as well. I think once we start looking at phonology as a model, as syntax as a model, there's lots of interesting questions to ask where I think there's a better shot at animals can answer them. So that's kind of where we're going. I want positive results. I'm tired of having negative results from animals. I want things they can do. So we're going to be looking at various levels of subregular grammars where we think they have a good shot at it.
I want to get back to this issue of what language and music might have in common, and to Dr. Trehub's last observation about how they might differ from other systems of core knowledge, and wonder what you both think about the following. One of the reasons I think why subsequent cognitive development in domains for which there is an initial system of knowledge, like knowledge of objects and number and so forth, is that we don't get to choose what the end state is. It depends on the state of the world, right? I mean, so we don't get to choose that the 7th number we're going to get by successive addition of 1 won't be prime after all, or whatever. So we have to learn how the world actually is, and that can involve both extending and adjusting our initial notions to that. But in the case of both language and music, we're dealing with something that's produced by systems that come about through the activity of other human beings with a large degree of independence, maybe total independence from how the rest of the world turns, well, except in trivial ways like you need to have oxygen or something like that. But for the most part, they're systems that have evolved over time to accommodate the activities that people engage in producing them, and that those people have minds like ours, and that could be part of the reason why they're easy to learn. I think that also could be part of the reason why they both carry emotional meanings. So one thing that I wasn't going to talk about, but research by Katie Kinsler and other people shows that very early in infancy, if an infant sees 2 people and one of them is speaking with their native accent and the other is speaking with a non-native accent, and they're subsequently asked in some completely non-linguistic context, which of these people would you rather engage with, either by giving them a choice of looking at one or the other, or letting them accept a toy that's offered by one or the other, they'll go for the person who previously spoke with their native accent. And similarly, Gaia Soli has recently showed that kids will preferentially engage with someone who previously sang a song that they know, and not someone who sang some hopefully equally, attempted to be equally simple, but unfamiliar song. And it seems like what could be going on in both these cases is that The other side of having a system that doesn't depend on the state of the world, the inanimate world, or the abstract world of numbers, but just on the activities of other people, could be that these are systems that you can only learn from other people. So prior to modern technology, you were only going to learn lullabies from other people. And if you see someone who knows a lullaby that you know, it was a good bet, until not very long ago, that there's a social chain that connects that person to you. And similarly for people who spoke with your native accent. So I wonder what you think about the idea that these domains are alike and different from the other core domains, both in that they're socially transmitted entirely and therefore carry social information about the people that exhibit them, and we don't have to mess with the structure of the world in order to get them right.
I agree, and I mean, and of course we do know that there are, we see a number of similarities across languages, a number of similarities across musical systems. But at another level of analysis, they're also more different than they're similar. So there still is a lot to learn. But domains that are socially relevant or really biologically relevant seem to be associated with very rapid learning. So if you set aside music and language and think about the smell of your mother, so babies very early on learn to recognize their mother's smell if they're breastfed. Okay, so that, but it does say something about the importance of that. But I don't think one can emphasize enough the social factors and the strong motivational pull. So there's just something about those domains that take you in and help drive that learning. So they are very special in many senses. And simply the fact that other people are transmitting is only coming through other people, that would go a certain distance. But the fact that we seem so compelled to share things with others, I mean, that happens on both sides.
If I can add, from the viewpoint of a bird, so songbird learning is, I think, another interesting example that's the same way. So it's not that there's no constraints. There are, of course, constraints on our vocal tract, and the birds have constraints on there. But I think to a first approximation, you're right. These are basically pure cultural objects that are transmitted over time. And so I think birdsong is actually a nice model of that. So whether you'd like to call that culture or not, we can talk about something that's transmitted over multiple generations. And one of the interesting findings is that there's both a deer-enemy effect, which means that if I'm a male and there's two males flanking me, I learned basically not to ignore their familiar songs. And also the females prefer males who sing the dialect that their father sang. So I think actually quite similar phenomena. But I didn't know the baby stuff. How old are the babies who prefer?
5 months.
Jeez.
So they're not yet talking, in the business of talking themselves.
So in the cutting that I did this morning, one of the things that I cut out from the talk that I think is an interesting finding too, or I think relates to what you're talking about, is that if you give babies, singing or speaking in an infant-directed style from an unfamiliar person, they just hear the audio. And then you give them silent videos of people doing different passages. They will, you give them, so they see the silent videos from the same person or from a different person, and they no longer imagine person, despite the fact that it's different material. So there are indexical cues. It's happening, really. Speech perception used to be thought of separate from person perception. When we are receiving phonemes, we're picking up indexical cues too. We seem to be doing musical performances.
You have a question, David? Pass the mic to David. Uh-oh.
just informational questions. I have a question for Sandra and one for Coppola. As a sociological observation, as a parent who, as a father who sang, although melancholy Tom Waits songs about alcohol and nicotine and two of my three sons, they still turned out okay. Notable absence of other caregivers singing there. I just have a very particular question about when you, at the end, raised or described when kids start to dance or start to move in some systematic way to rhythmic information, so song or music. Are there any data about the ability to tap along or move along? Because there's this interesting thing about adults tapping along, that they actually seem to be using a predictive model, right? That is, you're not reacting to the sound and lagging behind, you're anticipating the next thing. So you have an internal forward model that you've abstracted and that you're anticipating. So I wonder if there's any evidence when that happens.
Well, it really takes a number of years to become accurate. So, maybe something resembling some kind of coordination at 3 or 4 years of age, but it's really very, very loose. So the tighter coupling, and it's not even perfect later in ordinary individuals. But so it generates the rhythmic movement, but it really they can't somehow or other manage that predictable coupling until later childhood. So it's hard to describe it in terms of a model because people have enough difficulty relating it to the material that they're listening to.
May I also add a bird's eye observation on this, which I can't resist since Henkjan is in the audience. So for a long time it was thought that only humans could tap to the beat. So that was a uniquely human thing that was based on some really bad experiments on chimpanzees and very little else. So people think chimps can't do it, therefore no animals can do it. But then, what is this, 3 years now? I think that a series of papers show that actually parrots can do it. And it looks like all species of parrots that have been tested. So songbirds can't do it, other vocal learners can't do it, but for whatever weird reason, that's a capacity that we share with parrots, and as far as we know, only parrots. Which is very interesting. At least now we have an animal model for it.
So let me add one other finding to that might go against conventional wisdom. So we always think that if you use simpler materials, people will be able to do the tasks better. But if you ask kids to tap or move to the beat, they do better with more complex materials than with simple materials.
So they can't tap to a metronome as they can to a song.
So there's a lot of redundancy in music, as there is in speech. And so you give this, multiple instrumental to, and you do a better job.
If I can ask a question to Tecumseh,
No, I think as the
Yes.
So all of the discussions here, and yours in particular, raise that there are innovations for human language, like syntax and semantics were two that you raised. Actually, it's an interesting question how similar or different those are. That's a question for research. And signals, some aspect of processing the signal. And one thing that hasn't come up very much is what have become the elements of these computations, namely the fact that we have this pretty interestingly structured vocabulary lexicon or roots or whatever theory you want to adopt. I don't know to what extent that is a specialization or not, and that's what I'm asking you is, it's a remarkable fact that we know, let's say, 10,000 to 100,000 items that are actually very similar, whatever language. That is, they're made up out of a pretty restricted primitive vocabulary, and they have to be stored in a way that you can retrieve them online within 100 to 200 milliseconds on the fly for recognition or production. And so that must mean they have very interesting properties so that you can get them to the sensory motor interfaces, which, as Chomsky called them, are ancillary, and so, as per Jim, not relevant to study language anymore. We only need CI systems to study immersion. But are those, what about the specialization of actually knowing such an enormous amount of information that's structured in a way that's very specific?
So that was a very kind and gentle, what's happened to you? All this fathering has made you much nicer than I was expecting. No, I think it's a very interesting point. So again, we can separate the underlying representations from the instincts to learn that give us those representations. And if I'll just stick with in the domain of the signal, where I think we can actually say quite a lot. If you look at syllable structure, syllabaries that the size of the syllabary in humans, you find huge variation. I mean, so there's this kind of standard CV pattern that you find in about half the languages. But numbers of consonants, numbers of vowels, the kinds of consonants, so things like clicks and other weird stuff, or things like that lots of. So there seems to be a huge amount of variation there. Nonetheless, kids seem to just hone in on that very quickly. So that seems like an example where it's not free variation, of course, because you have to do it using your vocal tract, and there's no language with things like as a phoneme. But other than that quite loose constraint, it seems like kind of anything goes in terms of the actual units of the syllabary. Nonetheless, there are these really interesting constraints on if you have 3 vowels, they will be these 3 vowels. If you expand that to 5 vowels, you get them in a very predictable order. And I would say that all of that kind of structure is a reflex of the learning mechanism of the processing rapidly of the kind of representational meat that's being rearranged. So that was point 1. And point 2 is, again, I guess
I completely agree. Now you've made my problem harder. As you've now said, the range is even more restricted of the primitives that construct these tens of thousands of things which we have.
Good. So
now
I'll make your problem easier now with the second part, because I think this is another great place where birds really have something to offer. So we have birds that have incredibly complex syllabaries, and they're doing the same thing that we do. So this, take a male mockingbird or a male nightingale singing. My favorite example are thrashers, where it looks like the basic set of units, and these are small things, syllable-sized things, is like 10,000. Okay, so great big syllabary, and yet the bird is putting these together in real time. It's not just singing storm songs. These real sort of elaborate songsters are actually creating new things all the time. So I think and we don't have the answer to this yet, but I think the birdsong model provides a very nice model for how we can actually start to get a basis for this, and what kinds of characteristics does a syllabary have to have, or a lexicon have to enable that quick access. The unfortunate fact is that everybody's now focused on the zebrafinch, which is the boring, the simplest and stupidest robotic bird on the planet. So they basically and they do the exact same every single time they sing. So the animal models that we want to address the question that you're asking are at the other end of complexity. So these guys who are singing with variety, have very large syllable counts, and who can keep learning throughout their life. I think that would be a better model for what we do, for what humans do. Sure.
I hate to come onto this right after your zebrafinch comment, because it goes back to the zebrafinch. You mentioned in your talk the situation with the starlings and trying to have them learn a context-free grammar, and apparently having done so and then discovering that in reality you said it was because they had lumped the birds together. Can you expand on that? Because I'm curious whether that's an analytical flaw, or that it might be that the group in looking at the group in concert, you might get the effect of a context-free grammar even when no one individual has it.
So just to clarify, I didn't say that. Carlton Kate and his
zebrafinch.
Yeah, the critique of the starling stuff comes from here in Holland, and it's not my critique. I read it. I actually organized a conference where both groups were in the room, and I watched them argue about it. And I remain on the fence, so that's why I have that question mark. I think there's some more controls that are needed. A larger number of birds is needed, so that's one of the problems, that these tend to have very small sample sizes. But the basic idea is this, that it's very easy with a population to get multiple birds doing different finite state grammars, that when you collapse those across, so basically the whole population, they appear to exclude everything other than the grammar, than the target grammar. The way to get around that is very easy. You test individual birds. And that's what Tecumseh did. You look at the individual birds and look at what tests they pass and don't pass. And that's where you can say, each of these birds learn their own weird context, finite state grammar. And it's only when you lump them together that you get the impression that they learn. With one exception that they called Zebski. So they did have one bird that looked like it might be getting it. But he failed on the A to the M, B to the M task, so Zebski doesn't.
I was just thinking, if you have that kind of an effect and you have a mutation, and you suddenly have a bird that can process context-free grammars, that would be nice input to them as a group.
Yes, absolutely. Zebski.
Just briefly, I'll speak loud. in defense of Ghent, 9 out of the 11 they claim learned the pattern. So they did actually discard 2 individuals. So they must have paid some attention to individuals.
Right, but this is about the analysis. The analysis did lump all birds together.
The analysis of the 9 or of the 11?
Of the 9.
Of the 9.
They lumped all of those 9 together.
Okay.
That's the key criticism.
Okay.
And I think if it were the case that the individuals had each lost it, they would have published that analysis, and they haven't.
Yes, the question for Tecumseh. Sorry, it wasn't at your call, but still, I was going to ask you whether there's new facts or discoveries on learning mechanism in birds, because we know that there's this area X in the bird's brain, which is similar, I don't know how much similar to what makes us learn languages and dialects, right? So we know that birds learn dialects, and did we ever think about using models of variation and acquisition that we design for language in order to add for birds, right? Yeah, so.
Well, if you'd come to my talk, you would have seen that slide 23 was exactly that. Well, I'm not sure why you're honing in on area X. So area X is involved in learning and isn't required later, so you can lesion it after the bird has crystallized its song and it doesn't do it. But the standards part that people pay attention to, that the birdsong guys think is the crucial thing, is called HVC, the higher verbal center. And that's one that without that, you just don't get a song. And all the song learners have that. The ones with complex repertoires have larger HVC.
They're related in this area.
Well, yeah, there's the beauty of birdsong is that we know every single one of these nuclei. We know a lot about, we know much more about birdsong neuroscience than we do about human language neuroscience. Because you can do things like raise the birds without any input, and lots of people have done things like give the bird input that's outside of their species' typical range and see what they do. So you can really push the system in a way that wouldn't be very nice to human beings. Well, the birds don't care. So a great example is speed it up. So you take a male sound and then speed it up faster and faster. And they do their best. They try and sing as fast as they can. But you can see what the limits of the learning mechanism are.
You know, because context-free or finite state is a very general way to characterize the grammar. And the question still arises how to get the dialects and how to, birds learn the dialects in some context and go to the ancient variants in other contexts. So that's interesting as well, right?
Yeah.
Think about it.
Well, Bob Rooryck has a review paper that just came out suggesting that we can understand all of that variety with subregular at a particular with a particular level of finite state grammar. That's a hypothesis that's out there.
We had a little bit of this discussion together, but then it would be interesting to open it to the audience. Well, the brain mechanisms that you feel are responsible for these 3 different hierarchical levels, I suppose, from 3 to 2 to 1 to have the supra-regular grammar. So how do you link this evolution to the evolution of the brain, and what are the brain structures and functions which are associated with it? We discussed the issue of, let's say, global neural workspace, or some kind of working memory space which would increase in high mammals. Is it sufficient, or do you certainly not? But do you think it's a limiting factor? Just coming back to the George Miller issue of having this number, which are maximal number that one can process in the working memory, which is, let's say, it's called unique to humans. This particular number.
I'll let Sandra Trehub answer that. We don't know the answer to that, obviously.
But you may have hypotheses about that.
Yeah. So I think that the most insightful way to use formal language theory and the theory of computation is to recognize that there's a basic finite state system that's predictive, that's available, that's just a basic part of pretty much any vertebrate brain that we can look at. And of course that can vary in its capacities in interesting quantitative ways. But the interesting thing about this formal language hierarchy is that to go beyond that, you need some additional form of memory. Okay, so the simplest form would be a single counter, or two counters to do the A to B and B to the end thing. You can also get more complex things like push-down stacks, et cetera, et cetera. Now there is evidence that for something like a push-down stack language or human memory, but I don't think we know kind of where that is or what, so I'd be happy to say some aspect of the global workspace. And that indeed the crucial thing is to go beyond these finite state models, is to add some element, some different kind of memory. Global, it should be globally applicable, it should be cross-modal. That's the basic thing. But I think the interesting part about the working memory actually comes back to what Lisa was talking about yesterday, the whole chunking. So what good does it do you to be able to chunk? And the answer is a huge amount of good, because you just expanded, in a sense, you can expand your working memory without bound to the extent that you can basically build chunks that are however many items that you want. If I can recognize a 16-item chunk and I can treat that as one thing, if I can label that as one thing, I just increase my working memory.
The total number of chunks is limited.
Yeah, the total number of chunks is limited, but you can expand your item memory.
So, of course, it happens in music too. So, using all the perceptual improving principles. So, so what may look like, if you view it as simply a complex string, with a number of items that would exceed, working memory capacity, but in fact, those are being chunked in a certain way.
I bet you can all imitate those 32 notes if you were familiar with those.
So could I ask you about this birds, as an analogy, as a bird song study? I think it's super future. And I think it's sort of a nice analogy to homeland, and I just wonder whether you think it's like a legitimate kind of study. So with it's zebrafinch, so they take isolated birds.
Yep.
So you know this, and in the first generation they sing a sort of non-natural song, and then over generations, so those isolated birds, and then the input to the next generation, and then eventually over 5 generations they get back to being like native bird song guys, and it's sort of a little like what might be happening in Carlos.
Yeah. Well, this paper that was published in Nature 2 years ago from over Chernkovsky's lab. I worked in News and Views, and this was the article for that. So you take a zebrafinch, raise it with no input, and it sings. They try and sing. It has very strong motivation to sing. They sort of it's not at all a natural song. Females don't like it, but if you stick some females in the box with them, they will eventually mate. And then these babies are exposed to it. And the second generation sort of goes. And then if you do that, they repeat it, I think, 5 generations. And by the end, they had, in a sense, created a whole new zebrafinch song that's within the normal parameters of zebrafinch, of what you find in zebrafinches in the wild. So it's a kind of cumulative culture. It's the best evidence we have for something like that. That after a while, the instinct to learn birdsong kind of corrects this initially adopted.
But what's the mechanism? It's not genetic,
I think it's genetic. It's constraints it's constraints, innate constraints on the perceptual and learning system.
And why doesn't it come out the first generation?
If I draw
Requires some environmental input.
well, no, not just environmental input. It requires the sort of work of past generations. It's like our culture. We didn't invent this overnight. I can drop you on an island. It's not like you're going to have cell phones and cable TV.
But it's a really nice analogy for the Robert sign language, perhaps, where the first generation is home sign and may have a little bit. It sounds a little like language, but with each generation, it's sort of built up.
Yeah. So for this paper, I urged them to talk about Nicaraguan Sign Language, and they were like, whoa, no, that's going too far. So in my news and views, I did. I exactly said, this is like Nicaraguan Sign Language. So I'm totally, I think it's good enough.
These experiments where you compare on AK-BK grammars humans and birds, are you really comparing humans and birds, or humans who have a count list and birds? So if you were to take this experiment off to various parts of the Amazon, would you expect to get the same result? Are the numbers low enough that it wouldn't make a difference?
I should have my slide for this because the postdoc spent a good 2.5 years of his life doing this with the Piranha, who famously they don't lack recursion, but they do lack a count system. They do lack, people argue about whether it's one too many, or Dan Everett says they only even have 1 or 2. But in any case, what they don't have is a clear counting system. Unfortunately, they failed at basically every task that we threw at them. And I don't think the reasons have anything to do with Piranha cognition, because we then repeated this with illiterate Brazilian Portuguese speakers. So in a very similar, depauperate environment, and these guys couldn't do these tasks either. So we have Brazilian undergraduates who can do all of our tasks, Scottish and German undergraduates who can do it all. And then we have these illiterate Brazilians who speak Portuguese, which certainly have a count system, who actually failed even on the ADTN task. So that of course doesn't tell us anything interesting. It tells us that when you show up in some weird culture and put the computer down and try to do these experiments, some people, including people who, one of my postdocs, a Brazilian Portuguese native speaker, so it's not like it was me trying to do it. So really trying to get these kids and adults to do it, and they couldn't even do the simplest tasks. So yes, we have tried. I don't think that tells us anything at all interesting about my problem or the Piranha. I think it just shows that we can't expect to export our environment, our kind of experimental environment that works on undergraduates to the rainforest and interpret those negative results.
But isn't that disturbing about your animal results?
No. We always have a positive result from our animals.
Oh, wait a minute.
That's
so
crucial.
They couldn't even do
A
the
to the
finite
end.
state grammar.
No.
But the
They couldn't do
animals
it
take
to the end.
weeks to learn how to do it, right?
Sorry?
Didn't you?
Can you explain what was so difficult?
Wasn't it clear? Didn't you say earlier that the animals take a long time to train to do the tasks?
Actually, we have non-training tests, and we also use habituation, dishabituation, where it's mere exposure, they get a bunch of positive results, and then they correctly generalize.
Okay,
no
so
training at all in those ones.
if you could transform that somehow into something that would be reasonable to do with a human, presumably you would get the same result. But that's
I certainly
odd.
believe that
That's very odd, right?
Can do what a monkey can do.
Right, but I
Yes,
think that's
absolutely.
at the core of reconciling these different findings, right, in these different populations.
Yeah, well, I was talking to Stan about the idea that we could, that doing this with a neural technique like mismatch negativity, with EEG or something, that, I mean, we're not going to do fMRI in the rainforest, but we could at least in principle do EEG with the Piranha or other groups. So I mean, maybe that gets around all these task demands and the weirdness. I think for one of the things, it's just weird for them to have somebody forcing them to make a yes/no decision. That's just not, that's something, yeah, on a task that doesn't make much sense. But for example, we tried this, my first attempt with the Piranha, they'd hear one or the other, they'd be trained on a grammar where if it was AB to the N, this disembodied red monkey head would go up to the left, and in the other cases it would go over to the right. They loved this, they were like monkey, and they were really into it, and they looked at it for a long time. But they didn't show any predictive, what we were hoping for was predictive eye movements in the right direction. So if they mastered the grammar, they would look there first where the monkey should be going. So that was what we thought was a very clever idea based on infant work. It didn't work. No predictive eye methods. So we've tried a lot of stuff. Poor Miguel Oliveira spent a lot of time in the rainforest trying different things, trying coaching them in various ways, trying different kinds of reward, doing it, translating everything into Piranha, so they were getting Piranha backup, and they can't even do the simplest task. So it's not because we're lazy and we didn't try to do a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
But it isn't an interesting, ultimately it's not an interesting result for this group because I don't think it tells us anything about Piranha cognition or innateness in humans. It just shows that sometimes it's hard to design the right experiment.
I just had a quick comment to follow up on Susan's point about the parallels between the zebra finches and Nicaraguan Sign Language. I don't remember off the top of my head the details of that study, but was it always one zebra finch providing input to the baby?
No, they have replicates.
Didn't they do it 2 ways? Where they had it isolated and they had groups?
Yeah, they always had multiple. They always had multiple listeners. But what I don't remember is whether they ever had two singers.
My point is that what's important about Nicaragua is the community aspect, right? So the difference between the home signer gets no linguistic input from anybody, right? That part is the same. And then what happens next, is a situation where you get these language-ready brains in this, they're immersed in a community where everybody is in the same boat, right? So that, I think, is a difference that should not be
right. But I think they actually had two different studies, one which, okay, that's my memory, but I now remember it now.
I'm afraid I've seen too many versions of that paper to remember exactly.
Right.
Yeah, just something to
I'm pretty sure it doesn't. It does not require the community effect. It's not like Nicaraguan Sign Language. You could get it if it's one bird passing it on to essentially a single chain. So you don't need a whole bunch of things.
right.
Singing
And we don't have many examples,
Right.
many natural experiments with humans where that happens, right? Where you get one, not going to happen. There are some situations where you have family systems, but those tend not to persist very long for all kinds of different reasons, but that's kind of the only other place to look.
I'm going to take chair's privilege again. On AN, BN, and Alex, does anybody know? Okay, so if you showed Alex a number of objects, you could say how many. I think he could say 2 or 3 or whatever.
Sure, absolutely.
And if you showed him 2 collections of things, and you say what's same, he could say color or material or whatever. Did he ever do that for number? If you showed him collections which only were similar in the number of objects in them, and said what's same, could he say number?
I don't believe so. It's not like I know every experiment that's been done, and there's a lot that's unpublished. But I can't remember it.
If he could, it would have been interesting from this point of view.
Yeah, that's true.
I was just going to ask something that's very striking about your presentation compared to Chomsky's is that you have in common that you focus on the computational side of language to the detriment of the lexicon. Not in the sense of how big the lexicon is or having built up words out of syllables, but with respect to the content, sort of the interpretation of lexical items. And I was just wondering if any work is going on in comparative biology looking at lexical notions. I mean, you take sort of universal distinctions that are found in human languages. For example, the guess would be every language has a man-woman distinction. Every language has a thing-person distinction. If you look for those distinctions in other animals, what happens?
Well, there is a nice comparative literature on lexical acquisition, and surprisingly enough, the current champions are domesticated dogs. The largest vocabulary we know is about 1,000 nouns. So the classic example, besides Alex and Nim and Kanzi. So Kanzi and Alex were both claimed to have on the order of 300 words. And a dog named Rico, which basically you do the experiments by having nonsense. It's like a Blickett experiment in the child language. So you have some new object that it doesn't know. Go put that in a room with a bunch of other objects that it does know, and then say, find the Blickett. And it's got like a teddy bear and a cat and things that it does know. The dog goes into the other room, checks it out. There's only one object that it doesn't know, and it brings that back. So it's mutual exclusivity in a dog. And it remembers that, so that's fast mapping. Now all this is based on humans interacting with dogs. It's not an analysis of animal language.
Also, it sounds like, as so often, it's just about object name.
Yeah, it's nouns.
Rather than relation. Well, not, but it's very specific types of nouns. I mean, not typically nouns like man and woman, man versus woman, or mother or father, or abstract nouns like, nouns that have a general sense like thing.
He can do superordinate categories.
Yeah. Well, and the work with Alex shows that things like comparators like same and different are accessible. I think there's plenty of evidence for that. In terms of verbs, there's not as much. But a lot of this is probably just, it's hard to do these experiments. It's not trivial. And so I guess I don't think we have any good evidence right now that animals' lexical abilities, a failure of animals' lexical abilities is a kind of key determinant of why we can do language and one's kin.
Yeah, a question for Sandra. In your last sheet, you quickly you revealed your position towards core knowledge and or possible innateness of cognitive mechanisms related to music. Could you elaborate a little bit on it in the sense that we think what might be fundamental to music is at one hand beat induction or being able to synchronize the music, at least some researchers agree on that, and the other one might be relative pitch. Do you see that as typical cognitive human functions, or and in what way might they relate to, for instance, number or object recognition? Is there, do you think, they have relationships, or could they be sort of very separate?
Well, I guess the way in which I was thinking about them as being separate was that in those, the main core systems that are being described, you see something that looks like a similar system in the non-human realm. So with language and music, the fact that these are, unique human abilities, you don't have, it's not that there aren't precursors in some of the component skills. So that's not the case, but that, when people were talking about number or space or whatever, or object knowledge, I mean, they could do similar experiments to those they were doing with inputs. So you can't do anything comparable, or anything you do doesn't go anywhere. So, even with, say, Dermot's experiments, forget about simply consonance and dissonance, you give them the choice of music and silence, and they prefer silence. So they prefer, conspecific appetitive sounds to it. So the design of this study work, but they have no interest in the domain. So it's sort of hard to ask those kinds of questions. So I think there's a discontinuity there because these domains have special significance for you. So that's the sense in which, so I think each of those domains has core knowledge in, when we use it in the most general sense. I guess the way it's being defined theoretically is really tied to other species. So it's in that sense that there's a discontinuity. But, and I don't think that, like in the long run, of course, although the systems become modular, there may be some modular aspects earlier on, but I'm not convinced that. I don't think there's like a music acquisition device that corresponded to the old LAD. So, nevertheless.
Modular over a lifespan or modular over?
Well, yeah, but I mean, sort of initially that, it's this thing bursting to get out. However, there are these strong dispositions. There's strong interest in that domain, strong dispositions. So dispositions both to display these kinds of things and dispositions to receive these kinds of things, organize the kinds of input in distinct ways. So relational processing, in principle, even these species that do a good job in terms of pattern perception. So there are two, clear demonstrations of relational speech processing in the non-human brain. But, you have to train forever to get them. So in Tony Wright's study, 2000, thousands of trials over months. You bring infants into a lab, give them a test that takes a few minutes, and that's it. So there's generalization right away. So they perceive that equivalence. And in the more recent study with Bregman and Patel and whatever, it's also a lot of training, and it only happened with conspecific things. Okay, so I mean, it happens with infants, even with what are essentially arbitrary patterns, whether it's composed of sine waves or musical tones or whatever. So that generalization is totally working. So there are some things that seem different especially across region.
If I could just because people might not have got this, so this is about relational processing of pitch in humans, which we all do. That's what everybody in this room has. Absolute pitch, where you actually hear notes as a frequency that's fixed, is actually what most animals do. So we all think, oh, absolute, so-called perfect pitch is this amazing thing that only the best composers have. Actually, that's what pigeons have, that's what starlings have, that's what most animals have. And what's funny about us is our relational is the fact that we actually care about the relationships between frequencies more than we care about their absolute frequency.
So the interesting thing is that, so the notion was, historically people thought, well, we start out as absolute pitch processors, and there's a shift sometime to relational pitch processing. But they're both there from the beginning. It depends on the nature of the material. So in general, there's this disposition for relational pitch processing. But if you give them a vocal performance, they'll remember the pitch level which was presented. So you just, send a CD home or, transmit the information some way. They listen to this foreign lullaby by an unfamiliar singer, and they just sort of hear it in the background or whatever, bring them into the lab, and they will listen longer to the performance of that same lullaby they listened to at home at a novel pitch level, which tells you that they remember the pitch level which was presented. So, so you have both of these things, but relational processing dominates. The ways in which we test often don't show the absolute processing. So if you use familiar material, so things that you've heard a lot. So in North America, maybe different in Europe. So in North America, the dial tone on the telephone is always exactly the same. People have an excellent memory, so you give them a version of the exact one and a pitch shift version, even with time pitch shift. They identify the correct one. And, so in general, we don't remember in terms of, with recordings, we're not so bad. We listen to them a lot.
Yeah.
So,
Staying alive is a good example.
Yes, yeah. Or in Oregon, I did it with, the soundtracks from people's, their favorite TV programs. They all recognized. I mean, I didn't know any of them. I had never watched the program, so to me, they sounded just fine either way. But for the students, Law and Order, all of those things, Jeopardy, right on.
One more question.
So this relates a little bit to several of the points that have been raised. From my perspective, the source of the origin of meaningfulness is not per se in say, the lexicon as such, the richness of the lexicon, and how it hooks up with social. What you really need is something like the origin of a Boolean structure. Right? So you need a number of operators, something like negation, conjunction, and disjunction, and crucially, the right relations between these guys. So without this apparatus, the lexicon can't do anything. And the crucial part, so obviously you can identify, say, in bird's behavior or in any one behavior, things that you describe in terms of is, them, ors, and nots. Right? But the question of how much Boolean structure is really there. So for instance, if you learn the meaning of not and the meaning of and the meaning of or, you immediately know that, say, don't eat and talk means don't do them together. Don't eat or talk means don't do either, right? And so on, incredibly quickly for all these
host of. And the question is, can we study this in, because until we don't get the source of that.
No, I agree, and I would suggest that what we know about the lexicon's the easy part. Those connectives and building up an infinite range of expressions from that is the hard part.
I'm sorry, I have to object to that's not the easy part, because these Boolean operators could be part of the richer lexical representation. That's the point.
Okay.
As the lexical representation itself is extremely rich. That's what makes it the interesting link to the conceptual intentional interface. This isn't just a string of sounds, right?
Okay.
It's a string of sounds with meaning. And so the Boolean operators can be crucially part of the representational infrastructure. That's what gets us going. Then comes the don't eat or speak. But I mean, distinguishing something like mass and count isn't a triviality. That just doesn't come from a series of sounds, right? That's from a very rich structure in the representational embedding of lexical items. So I want to link back to Richie Kayne's issue of like, no, it's actually not just about a bunch of things. That's an extremely deep problem, how you store this kind of information.
I completely agree. So you guys are right. The human lexicon has an incredibly complex structure, and we can't evaluate that structure by just counting the number of words you can do. The kinds of experiments that we can do with animals, if we're talking about what kind of comparisons can we do, the kind of stuff we can do is at this very low and simple level. It's a link between some sound pattern and some object out in the world. That's easy for animals, at least we know. And what we don't know is whether they can actually start to build more complex structures with and and or. So we have things like evidence for saying different, but what I don't know of, that's a behavioral level, not at a lexical level. So I would suggest that we do have various parts of the apparatus that you're talking about lying around. We can, at least in different animals, we can find evidence for different things. But what we don't have good evidence for right now is maybe putting them together. But part of this is it's really hard to do the experiment. So tell me a good experiment. I was talking to Sciullo about this. How do we show not? So what's our evidence that animals can do not?
I think reversal learning experiments show that the animals can do not. The apes, but not monkeys, can do not.
But as you're well aware, there's a huge argument about this, and there's some pretty telling arguments against that really being not. I mean, there's a lot of tricks that you can use to do reversal learning. And again, reversal learning is hard. That's something that animals find very difficult, and even
Harder for kids to do.
Okay. So if there was just this not operator lying around, it should be like first trial. It should be like, cool, there goes not. Okay.
It comes a lot easier to apes than it does to monkeys.
Well, there's a very nice sort of correlation actually with brain size, which may be more about global workspace and ability to executive override stuff. But I don't think that gets to this point about the complexity of the lexicon. And so in a modern view, in the sort of lexicalized versions of most modern grammar, I think a lot of the work is actually being done by the lexicon, which sort of, I mean, if you are a lexicalist, so to speak, and you think that the lexicon actually is really complicated, maybe it's full of constructions and all this kind of stuff. Okay, we've just moved the area where we think the difference is from syntax into the lexicon. But I'm not sure that our tools for studying that in animals, I don't know how that helps me do experiments with animals that are going to get at these fundamentally combinatorial logical operators. I'm all ears. You guys, I've thought a lot about this. How do we do these kinds of experiments? And my answer has always been avoid semantics and avoid the lexicon. I can do speech, and I can do at least this kind of syntax, at least the simple level we can do.
We promised Richie on that question.
I was just thinking, given what you said about dogs, it reminded me that there's a small sub-tradition in syntax that distinguishes noun-like elements from verb-like elements with respect to the notion of projection, taking verb-like elements to be the only ones that project in the sense of syntax. Putting that together with what you said about dogs, an interesting conjecture would be that non-human animals can only learn items that do not project.
Well, animals can learn verb-like things. So animals, you can teach your dog to sit. That's an action, so you can say sit as a verb. Dogs call it. It's easy for dogs to learn that. Whether that projects, Maybe somebody has a dog that you can say sit slowly versus sit fast.
There's another question. The tradition started by Helen Kaiser, which is that if you take their position to the extreme, sit is not a verb, even in English. Most verbs are actually combinations of so-called light verbs plus noun. You don't normally, it's not obvious. No. Sit itself could be the noun.
Sit is a noun. And where's the light verb? What's the light verb?
It's right next to it.
To.
It's a silent counterpart of do.
I still ask, how can I test that? Okay, point taken. I like the idea about projection being a limitation. That's interesting.
There's a sense in which projection is really part of syntax. And it could be that there's a sense in which nouns are used by syntax as part of
Yep.
Well,